710 KURV. Talkback with Dr. Gelman, home of the iron microphone, scientific conservatism. We believe in the principles of the founding of the nation based upon philosophy of individual liberty, freedom, and independence, and the overturn of the divine right of kings, which has become reimplanted in our fascist dictatorship in Washington, D.C. today. In this program, we don't preach to the choir, we teach the choir how to sing. And that's very important because where's our side on this issue? Certainly not the Republican Party, at least outside of Ron Paul. The Republican Party is not libertarian. The Republican Party is not even conservative. The Republican Party is a mafioso family fighting it out with the other mafioso family called the Democrats. We try to show you what our country was supposed to be and how it became suborned by the political class. Nothing new. It's what they have done since man first appeared on earth, ever since government first appeared. Ruled by those who believe that somehow intrinsically and innately they are smarter, better, and more adept than the rest of us. And if we don't believe it, there's a firing squad wall ready for us anytime that we wish to state our complaint. We look at things in the news and it defies logic. What is the latest thing? I don't know how this all works. Do they all get together? Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, KURV, and all the rest. They all kind of get together, sit around and figure, well, the population is ignorant, and we have done that purposefully through our system of public education, easily indoctrinated by the mass media. And what is going to be the bill of fare this week in order to incite the population? And lo and behold, out of nowhere, Iran is now off the front page, and on the front page we have water. Water. Hillary Clinton, the brainless Hillary Clinton of the brainless Hillary Clinton clan, all the Clintons and the Rodhams, the brainless statists that they are. And what is she talking about? She's concerned about water, that in the future that the new issue will not be energy supplies and oil. It is going to be the wars over water. And something needs to be done because we need to hoard our water, because that is going to be the new edge of conflict, water. And so the American people listen to Hillary Clinton and listen to the fellow travelers and useful dupes such as Megan Fox and Dan Rather and Tom Brokaw on the media. And the new great concern and areas of conflict will be over water. And the thing that amazes me the most is that you have all these people out there now running around in the middle of the street crying, water rights, where's our water rights? Save the water. Save the whales, save the water. Well, my friends, look at the globe. Take a look at the globe. See all that blue? See all the blue on the globe? You know what that is? That's water. What is the most common substance in the world? The most common substance in the world is water. Water is the most common substance that we have in the world. There's more water than we know what to do with. Now, you know where most of the fresh water is? It's in ice. It's in ice in Antarctica, which holds 70% of all the fresh water in the world. It is untouched. 70% of the fresh water in the world, the fresh water is untouched. The vast amount of water in the world is completely untouched. Now, it is true that the salt water is something that will have to be treated to make it fresh. And then it's going to have to be transported. Right up to now, water has been cheap because it's been so accessible and readily accessible. But how is it that we treat energy today? Do we have oil in our backyards? Do we have oil right next door? Well, no, of course not. Oil is in deposits, far more difficult to get our hands on. We got to be drilling, and we got to be refining and all this other stuff. And then we got to be transporting. Isn't that what we do with oil? We drill it in the Arabian Peninsula or in Oklahoma or off the Gulf, off the coast of Mexico or in the North Sea. Very difficult to get at. We get at it. Certainly much more difficult than getting at water, which is all around us. And then it is taken and then transported. Pipelines and ships and trucks and all other means of transportation. And that's exactly what's going to happen with water. All the water will be, and it's what we have been able to do with oil is going to be far, far easier to do with water because water is far more accessible. And so water will be refined as we refine oil. Water will be transported in pipelines, tankers, and trucks, and on rail cars, just the way it is now with oil, and far more easily and far less expensively than for oil. And so it may cost us a little bit more than it costs us now, but there'll never be a shortage of water. It'll never happen, ever. And yet we have a media and a political class which depends upon, of course, they themselves are ignorant. I mean, Hillary Clinton is ignorant. She really believes there's a lack of water. She really believes that. But what's amazing to me is like, what is that old country song? Are you going to believe what I tell you or your lying eyes? The old country song. But isn't that, I mean, here, and they actually believe, and amazingly enough, there's actually those who go along that the great crisis of the future will be in a lack of water, the most common substance in the world. What can one do? Such is the product of our system of education in this country. There's this big deal about Chicago, the warmest march in Chicago's history. Obviously, evidence of a worldwide global warming catastrophe. And they all believe it. People believe it. Well, before this year, the warmest temperature in Chicago was 87 degrees, and that has yet to be hit. The temperature never got to 87 in Chicago in March yet this year. And looking at the forecast, it doesn't look like it will. By Monday, the temperature will be back down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The highest temperature achieved in Chicago over the last 120 years, 130 years. Now remember, the world is 3 billion years old. Man has been around at least 1 million years. Civilization has been around at least 10,000 years, and we've been measuring temperature in Chicago for 120 years. Nothing. The highest temperature in Chicago was in 1981. It was 87 degrees. That's more than 30 years ago. Highest temperature in March. That's more than 30 years ago. Clearly, there is more combustion of fossil fuels now in the world than in 1981. If the temperature increases in Chicago this particular March are due to global warming caused by man's combustion of fossil fuels, then why have we not hit the hottest? Why is the hottest temperature 30 years ago? Why was the previous hottest temperature in 1990 81 degrees, in 1990 22 years ago? Why wasn't it last year or the year before last? Why isn't it a trend, a steadily inexorable upward trend? Why is these peaks and valleys if it's actually due to man-produced global warming? Because the increase in combustion of fossil fuels has been increasing steadily since the Industrial Revolution began. So logically speaking, if all other factors are the same, then if it is man's combustion of fossil fuels which causes the increase in global temperature, then why hasn't it been a steady increase over the last 100 years? Why is it 30 years between one event and next? Why in 30 years will the warmest temperature in March in Chicago not be reached? Why are most of the warmest temperatures in the United States before 1950? If it's due to man's combustion of fossil fuels. Why did this last winter in Europe was the coldest in 100 years? If global warming is due to the combustion of fossil fuels and the increase in temperatures due to the increased combustion of fossil fuels. And yet we have this mass hysteria. This mass hysteria that the sky is falling. And here's all the evidence, contrary, but it doesn't matter that you have this mass hysteria promoted through the press. And every one of these issues does what? Whether it's energy or water, what is it they're trying to do? They're trying to give more power to the government. Oh, the government must control your energy expenditures, otherwise there'll be a catastrophic global warming. Myth. Oh, the government must do something about water supply and therefore constrain your use of water because we're running out of water. Myth. Yet these myths take hold. These myths that we are so susceptible to. Human beings are a superstitious lot, and we are sheep to a great extent. And this superstition we believe simply because it keeps being told to us over and over and over again in the mass media, in the system of public education, and we believe it. It is complete and utter nonsense. And we are here to tell you that the emperor has no clothes, that the government is populated by a bunch of liars, frauds, and dupes, and that we are lied to on a daily basis by the system of public education and by the government, and that they do so on purpose, and that purpose is not to preserve energy, not to preserve the environment, not to guarantee access to health care, not to guarantee access to water, but to increase the power of government. And anything that they can say or do which will result in that outcome, in that goal, they will do. And there's nothing new about that. There was a time in this world that people were led to believe that there were human beings born into the world, that by a divine right of God, instituted by God, that there were individuals born in this world that were selected by God to rule over the rest of us. And the country and its citizens believe that. And if they'll believe that, they'll believe that the offspring of a king or queen will, yet to be born, has the divine right to determine the course of the life of your children yet to be born, and that is a natural law handed down by God. The amazing thing not is that there are those who say it. The most amazing thing and distressing thing is that there are those who believe it, and they have believed it for hundreds and hundreds of years. Have we outgrown that mythology? Of course not. Every day on Fox News or on CNN or ABC or any of the other outlets, every single day in this country, the question will be asked, what is Barack Obama going to do about the economy? What does Barack Obama know about the economy? And what does the Constitution say about the president controlling the economy? Well, the Constitution doesn't say a word about the president controlling the economy. But yet, as we go to the Wizard of Oz to save us from the witch, and of course the Wizard of Oz was a fraud, we go to the President of the United States, who's no more than a human being and not as smart as most Americans in the United States. Barack Obama didn't invent the cell phone, the computer, Dell computer, Microsoft, Facebook, or any of the other marvels that we have today, television. In fact, Barack Obama hasn't invented anything or created anything of any lasting value. Neither did his predecessor, George Bush, or his predecessor, Bill Clinton. Yet the media says that what is Barack Obama, the president, going to do about the economy? The ignorance is noted by the question itself. The conceit and arrogance and narcissism is on the part of Barack Obama, who actually believes that he has the right to control our economic future and to determine the fate of every American. That's his arrogance. But it's our ignorance that asks the question. Because where in the Constitution does it say that we have a king? Where in the Constitution does it say that the president is in charge of the economy? Quite the contrary. The Constitution says the government is not in charge of the economy and needs to keep its hand off of the internal affairs of a state and the lives of the average citizen. But we've already lost when you have the moderators, the useful dupes on the television stating that what is the president going to do about it? We have lost the battle simply in asking of the question. The president has nothing to do with the economy and should have nothing to do with the economy and is in fact prohibited of having anything to do with the economy. Well, that is the level of ignorance and superstition that engulfs the nation today. Now, what we like to do on this program is illustrate general philosophical truths. And we must understand that government is evil. Some governments are less evil, some governments are more evil, but they are all evil. Whether they are a necessary evil is yet to be determined. In my opinion, they are completely unnecessary. Government is unnecessary. I would prefer to have no government than to be ruled by an entity that historically has taken us to war, committed genocide. I would much prefer to make it on my own without a government than to place my life in the hands of a Bill or Hillary Clinton, in the hands of a Barack Obama, in the hands of a George W. Bush. I would much prefer to take chances on my own without having an entity which believes it has the right to take away my life anytime it sees fit, that has the right to send me or my children off to war anytime that it sees fit, that believes it has the right to murder at will, that it has the right to commit genocide for whatever reason it gives, and to promote mass murder in the form of war. And what have these wars gained for us? We can measure the losses, but I defy you to measure the gains. Which leads us into fractional reserve banking. Well, that's a stretch, but really not. Because for the government produces nothing. So the government must take money from somewhere in order to finance its foreign adventurism, in order to finance its dictatorial regime here at home. Someone has to pay DEA agents to arrest 18-year-olds smoking marijuana. Someone has to pay environmental protection agents to go out there and say that the puddle on your land makes it a wetland and that therefore you cannot build a structure upon your own land. It needs the money from somewhere to create the Department of Interior that can close down parks because there's no one there to take your ticket. Those parks have been there long before the United States. Those forests and parks were there long before the United States even existed. But now a Yellowstone National Park can be closed, or the Grand Canyon can be closed to visitors if there's no federal agent to take your ticket for paying for access to the park. And why does the federal government have the right to charge anyone for access to something that is natural and open to all human beings? Fractional reserve banking is the means that the government has to print money. Fractional reserve banking, though it may sound a little peculiar, all that means is that a bank can lend out more money than it actually has in reserve. That and then it is able to pass out that money from money that is printed up by the Federal Reserve. So a bank takes a deposit of $100 and can loan out $1,000 or $10,000, depending upon what is the legal percentage at the time, which has been as low as 1%. Amazingly enough, in this country, banks were able to lend out money at 100 to 1. If they received $1 in a deposit, they were able to loan $100 upon that dollar. I don't know what it is now, if it's 5 or 10%, but even so, they're still able to lend out 10 or 20 times the amount that they have. Where do they get the money? They get it from the Federal Reserve. Where does the Federal Reserve get the money? They print it. They print it. Now, so fractional reserve banking exists. Why? It exists as a means, one, for banks to make profits, because if they can lend out $100 at 5% interest, they make more money than if they lend out $10 at 5% interest. And that is why the banks do it. Why does the government do it? Because they don't have enough money from tax revenues. And so therefore, if they're going to finance a war, if they're going to finance their dictatorial regime at home, they need to do that with money. And if they're spending $4 trillion a year to do that, and only $2 trillion a year comes in tax revenues, then that $2 trillion has to come from somewhere, and it comes from fractional reserve banking. That says that if you have collateral of $1, you can lend $100. The reason a Federal Reserve Bank was created, and was only created for one purpose, was to finance government adventurism and dictatorial rule. It was just too cumbersome and too annoying and too problematic for the government to have to defend tax policy, confiscation of money from the American people, and the American people that earned that money were to some degree resistant to governments trying to take their money. Well, understandable. Those of us who have a job and who don't like giving our money to government, especially when we see what they do with that money, are reluctant to give the government the money. So the government, rather than having to argue and debate and justify why they need the money, it is so much easier for them to print it up. And that is what they do. So every year they print up $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion so they can finance the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, keeping American troops in 150 countries around the world, and paying out food stamps and subsidies to farmers and sugar growers and all the rest. They do that in order to fund their friends, relatives, cronies, and, of course, their foreign adventurism and dictatorial regime. Somebody has to pay the DEA agent that is arresting the 18-year-old for smoking marijuana. And so that money comes from fractional reserve banking, the theory of fractional reserve banking. And the central bank, the Federal Reserve, was created so the government didn't have to go through the trouble of explaining to the American people as to why the American people needed to cough up more of their wealth. And so in order to avoid that sticky argument, they just printed up the money based upon no collateral whatsoever, which is another issue on that subject. We're going to a break. You've learned a lot. I learned a lot. 7 at KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK. Be back after this short commercial break. We're back. 7 at KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK. What we talk about on this station is beyond the understanding of most people in the world. So I imagine those that are listening are among the elite and able to understand. None of this is ever going to appear on the TV or on other programs on the radio. You're not going to hear this from any other commentator. You're not going to hear that. You're not going to see this anywhere else in the mass media. You're sure not going to hear about this in the system of public education. It's not there. It's only here. I wish it was elsewhere, but it wouldn't suit the government. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between government job creation and private sector job creation. Let's take a look at government job creation. How does the government create a job? Well, essentially, they do it out of thin air. They really don't produce anything of any value. So I'll tell you how we do government job creation. The government wants to create a job, and how does it do so? Oh, it builds a road, builds a dam, builds a bridge, builds something. And so let's take the bridge example. The government decides we're going to build a bridge across the river, and so we're going to have to get engineers. So you hire engineers, architects, design a plan for the bridge. Then you're going to have to hire people to build the bridge. So they hire people to build the bridge. The bridge needs materials. It needs steel, it needs concrete, other materials. And so the government places an order for concrete, places an order for steel. The steel company gets an order. It has to make the steel. It hires workers for the plant. It builds a plant or starts a plant up in order to make the steel. The concrete guys go out there and they start digging up for concrete, process it, hire workers to do that. The people on the job need to eat, and so there's restaurants that have to provide the food. So you have to supply them with food. And so the government creates these jobs, and it creates jobs in a kind of a ripple effect to the steel industry, the concrete industry, the architects and the engineers, and of course the people who are employed actually building, and then the money that they spend to buy clothes and other articles. That's the government way of doing things. But one day the bridge is done. The bridge gets completed. And so what happens? Well, you don't need any more labor. So you discharge the laborers. You don't need the engineer or the architect anymore, so you discharge them. You don't need any more steel, so the steel plant closes down, stops making steel, and lays off the steel workers. You don't need any more concrete, so the concrete guys close down and lay off their people. They no longer need food, and so the grocery store doesn't have that, has no one to sell that food to, and since the grocery store doesn't have anyone to sell that food to, they don't buy any more food from the farmer. So the grocery store goes out of business, the farmer goes out of business, and all the way down the line, and that's it. Now, of course, you build another bridge, but how many bridges can you build? And even how many bridges to nowhere can you build? So that's the way the government. So the government, and then of course, what use is that bridge? Well, for one thing, if for all the Americans who don't live anywhere near the bridge, it's of no use whatsoever. What's the point of it? And for most of the Americans that live near the area, if it's a bridge to nowhere, that's no benefit to them either. So what comes out of the building of the bridge? Well, a few jobs for a short period of time. And needless to say, those jobs will go to the cronies of politicians. They'll contract it out to the relative, friend, buddy, contributor for the politician. That's who's going to get the contract. And so it's kind of a dead-end street. Now let's take a look at private sector, consumerism. Let's take a look at clothes. All right, clothes. You want to buy some clothes, you go to a store, you look for a store. There's a clothier that creates a store to sell clothes. The person behind the counter and all the salespeople there that sell the clothes. Then you have the people who manufacture the clothes, and they have to have their plants and their people. And then the materials for the factory that makes the clothes, they have to get that. And those people they have to live, so they have to buy food, so they buy food, and they need other things. Transportation, cars, so they buy cars and they have transportation. Maybe they use the bridge to nowhere, I don't know. But not many of them, because there's clothing stores all over the place. And so, okay, but so I buy clothes, and then I have to buy more clothes, don't I? Because either new styles or the clothes wear out or no longer fit me. And so I have to buy more clothes. And that continues. It goes on, right? It goes on. I always have to buy clothes. And I have to buy clothes for myself, for my kids, and all of that. And so it's something I always need. It's not like the bridge to nowhere, which I may not use at all or use very infrequently. I always need to have more clothes. I always need to have more televisions, more cell phones, more computers, more iPads, more iPods. And I'm always buying more. So it's a continuing stream. I buy more that I use, and of course it's something that I decide that I want. Unlike the bridge to nowhere, which some government official decides they want for whatever reason, and maybe the people don't need and won't use. If I buy a cell phone, it's because I want it. If I buy clothes, it's because I want it. And so it's volitional. I make the decision, and I shop around for the best deal for myself. Unlike the government, which gives contracts to the biggest campaign contributor, I make the decision based upon what I want. It is not something imposed upon me by a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., something which I may not want, but which, unfortunately, I am forced to pay for. And so, in a consumerist market, which is always being denigrated in the media as being overly materialistic, and we ought to be willing to sacrifice our monies to non-consumer-oriented items, which is really great from people who are the biggest consumers and wasters in the world, which is Hollywood movie stars, ball players, and people in Washington, D.C., all of whom believe we're spending too much on ourselves, telling us this, flying around in their private jets. And so I buy what I want because I desire it with my own money, and it's a continuous cycle. Unlike the dead-end street of the bridge to nowhere, government creation of jobs, which is temporary, the consumerist, the private sector creation of jobs is permanent, because I'm always going to want more clothes. I'm always going to want more cell phones. I'm always going to want more televisions. I'm always going to want more internet. And so I continue to consume, which gives the reason for continued production. And so that is the difference between government job and private sector job. The problem with government job is to get the money, since it's something that I don't want, they have to take the money from me forcibly. When the government takes money from me forcibly, it leaves me less money to buy cell phones, cars, clothes, and other things. And so since I have less money to do that with, it's less money that goes to the productive sector of society, and the more money that goes to the non-productive members of society, which they take through force. Everything of government is force. They take from us forcibly, and to provide us things we don't want forcibly, versus the voluntary action where I voluntarily buy a cell phone, and the company doesn't force anything upon me. They try to convince me that their cell phone is better than the other guy's cell phone, but the decision is mine as the consumer. And there is the gigantic difference. Now, another problem is the more the government takes from the private sector, the less the private sector has to create the productive segment. If the private sector loses, if money is taken from the manufacturer, that gives the manufacturer less money to expand, less money to develop new products. Another problem is the more money taken from the manufacturer, the higher he's going to have to charge me for that cell phone, because there's a cost to creating a cell phone. There's a cost to creating a tomato. There's a cost to creating a television. The cost goes for labor. That has to be taken into account in the price of the product. There's a cost in rental, there's a cost in energy, there's a cost in all of these things that make up, that are part and parcel to making a cell phone. And therefore that cost has to be made up somehow, and it is included in the price of the product that I'm buying. Now, if the government makes energy costs more expensive, higher, if the government regulation makes the building of my plant more expensive, if I have to pay more in legal fees, if I have to pay more in taxes, all of those things which are not really necessary for the creation of the product, nevertheless have to be added on to the cost of that product. And the more costly a product, the less of that product will get sold, and therefore the less is going to be given to the productive class to create those products, making it more difficult to create more and newer and better products. But the government doesn't care, because the government is the thief. The government doesn't need to produce anything. All the government needs is to have a weapon in order to steal from the people in order to keep the government in power. And that is your economics lesson. And that is all you ever need to know about economics. The private sector is good and the government is bad. The private sector functions on a voluntary basis. The government works on a forced basis. They are coercive. The government steals coercively. The private sector is based on volition. Okay, we have Scoot calling from Port Isabel, 7 KRV. Thanks for calling, Scott. What's your comment, please?
Yeah, Dr. Gelman, and isn't it true with the government regulations on companies and private sector that's why we lost so many jobs in this country, because these companies couldn't make enough money and they moved their manufacturing plants overseas and taken away American jobs on top of it?
Absolutely. If you're a manufacturer, to take your plant and build it in China, a government that cannot be trusted, and to move your executive personnel to China, there has to be a reason. It's not just for fun. And so when a manufacturer and his board of directors, when they have to make a decision, their bottom line is profit. Obviously, if you don't make a profit, you go out of business. And they look at all the factors involved. Well, when labor costs are unnecessarily elevated because of government forced Social Security payments, which don't exist in China, requirements for health care insurance, which doesn't exist in China, the regulations produced by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Agency, et cetera, it does not exist in China. When all these other regulations are forced upon them, and in the highest corporate tax rate in the world, all of those. So when a company looks at what they have, and they say, well, if we manufacture in the United States, the product is going to be so expensive, no one's going to buy it. And the interesting thing is, and you're exactly right. You're exactly right. So let's just say you are an American plant and decides to stay here in the United States. And I'm going to ask you a question here. So the United States company makes a pair of jeans, and it costs $200. And then another company that makes jeans in China, that was in the United States, moved to China, and now they sell the jeans in the United States for $50. And you look at the two pair of jeans, and they're both the same quality, and they're both from the same manufacturer. They're both the same brand. And one made in the good old USA for $200, and you're a patriotic American. And then there's the brand made in China, which is exactly the same quality for $50. Which one are you going to buy?
Well, if I was financially stable and financially well off, I probably would buy the United States pair just to contribute to my country that I live in. But if I could not afford that pair, I would definitely go with the Chinese pair.
So you're telling me, Scott, that if you had two pairs of jeans sitting in front of you at Joe Brand's, and they're both identical in every way, and one costs $200 and the other one costs $50, that you would pay $200. Well, Scott, you're a great patriot.
Dr. Gelman, I would definitely go for the cheaper pair if they're the same quality as the pair that's built in the United States. The only problem I have found that under the quality that the United States built products seem to be a little better quality than the Chinese quality.
Do you have
the same manufacturer or equivalent to the same manufacturer?
Scott, do you have any Apple product? Any Apple product at all? A laptop computer, an iPad, an iPod. Do you have any Apple product?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I have a surfboard that was made in China, and I have a surfboard made in the United States. And the quality between the two can be seen just in the shipping.
I understand. I agree with you.
Okay, in the same, I have a guitar. I had a guitar before that was made.
I don't know if Apple doesn't make guitars. Scott, every Apple product is made in China. Every single one.
Right, and how about Nike? Every Nike product's made in China too.
That's true. But what I'm saying is, nobody thinks Apple products are of poor quality. Everybody, if Apple products were of poor quality, they would buy Hewlett-Packard, they would buy Samsung, they would buy something else. I mean, right? I mean, clearly no one is questioning the quality of the Apple product. They're all made in China. Now, I understand what you're saying. I've seen it many times that China...
That's an electronic, right, Dr. Gelman? Electronic? Well, how about a guitar? If you're any type of a guitar player and you go buy something that's made in Indonesia or South Korea or any place over there, and then you go buy an American one, the American one plays so much better, sounds so much better, and it holds the price.
No, then it makes sense. No, I agree. Then it makes sense. Clearly, if you're paying more for a higher quality product and it's American made to boot, then you win. But where are all the bicycles made? Where does Schwinn make its bicycles today? Where does Raleigh make its bicycles today?
Even the ones that are expensive, they're $500 to $800. They're all made in China or Taiwan.
You know, I defy you to find a bicycle made in the United States. But the thing is that there are things made in China of good quality and maybe not so good. But we can say that about the United States as well. But the fact of the matter is, your point is exactly correct. That we have lost jobs to China because the United States cannot make a $50 pair of jeans anymore, and not because the manufacturer is greedy, but because his costs are so elevated compared to China. He cannot sell jeans for $50 because they'll go out of business. So your point...
And these people are in this for a capitalist reason to make money for their and keep their companies going. The only way they can survive under the government regulations we have right now on top of them is to move over there. I think they'd be patriotic like I and rather employ Americans, since they got their American companies and the owners basically live in America and born in America, but they'd go out of business under the regulations that this government and President Barack Obama has on us. They wouldn't be able to survive.
Right.
So they have to move overseas.
That's exactly it, and the point is exactly correct. That it is government regulations which is driving American companies overseas simply for survival. Thanks a lot, Scott. I'm going to move on to another call. Thanks for calling. Now we have Hector calling from Mission 7 KRV. Thanks for calling, Hector. What's your comment, please?
Yeah, my comment was on global warming.
Okay.
You had kind of talked about that
earlier, yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm a teacher here. I'm not going to say where, but I teach here in the Valley. And one of the things that I tell the kids is you got to do research on that. And I tell them, I said, I don't know, you know who Jesse Ventura is, right?
Oh, sure, the wrestler, ex-governor, whatever.
I don't necessarily agree with all his politics and antics and stuff, but he has something on YouTube. You can look it up yourself, Doc, on YouTube. It's called the Global Warming Scandal. Okay, and he does a really good show on exposing what global warming is about, and it's basically a scam to allow companies to pollute, basically.
Okay.
Basically, if you watch it, you got to watch the whole thing. He does a really good job in telling people how that whole industry started, and from the IPCC up in Europe and stuff like that. The other thing that I tell my students is what happens in that context, and global warming and the scientists, What they have not done is they have not opened up their research to other scientists to allow to do their research to see, to basically see that their experiments are true. That definitely CO2 does cause, the temperature to go up and stuff like that. And there's another real good deal on it's actually a film on on YouTube, and it's called the Schoen scandal, SCHON scandal, where this guy basically claimed, hey, I invented the biological transistor. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. And the scientific community basically took his studies, and then they tried to mimic his experiments, and guess what happened? It did not work.
All right.
And so they called him out on it. Well, and I tell my students, look, this is what the scientific community needs to do with global warming, but the IPCC and their scientists, you know who I'm talking about, right? The IPCC out in Europe, they're the ones who basically started this whole scam about CO2, carbon, a gas that you exhale.
Yeah, also you do, by the way.
And that I exhale also. And not only that trees and plants turn into oxygen for us, basically is causing the earth to get hot,
Yeah.
And anyway, so I tell them, I said, they will not turn over their studies and open it up to the entire world so that they can do their own, follow their experiments to prove that, because it's a scam.
Right, it's all a scam. I think maybe what you're referring to is how it allows companies to pollute is the cap and trade deal, which doesn't really decrease carbon dioxide in the environment. You're just allowed to pay somebody to be able to pollute. So the whole thing is a gigantic scam, as exactly as what you're saying. And of course, whenever there's so-called scientific research, which they refuse to allow other scientists to test, well, then you always have to be suspicious that if they're so certain about the accuracy of their studies, then they shouldn't have any fear in allowing anyone to be able to look at what those studies are. So, but there's all kinds of ulterior motivations, a lot of money, power for companies and for the United States. Anything else?
Yeah, well, along with that, if you do
down to the last minute, so
if you do the research real quick, most of the people who got the money to do studies to show that CO2 increases temperature was all government money and as soon as they changed their mind, guess what happened to the research money?
Well, it goes away. It sounds to me like Jesse Ventura was actually looking at my DVD on the hoax of global warming. So, which, by the way, if you want, if you can send me your email to, I'll send one to you. Anyway, thanks for calling. We're have to go to a break. 7 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. .710 KURV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. We have a special treat today. We have Dr. Joe Rome from the Climate Progress Organization.org. And thanks for calling. Thanks for taking your time on this Saturday to join us in this discussion. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a physicist by training. I have a PhD in physics from MIT. I spent 5 years working at the U.S. Department of Energy. I was actually special assistant to may know in Texas, former mayor of Houston and Texas gubernatorial candidate. I spent a lot of time working with businesses to help them reduce pollution, save energy, and then for the last several years, I have been writing a blog, climateprogress.org, on climate science and clean energy and the like.
Okay, well, thanks. So your position on global warming is, or if there is global warming, is what?
Well, through many independent lines of observation, we know that the Earth is warming at an unprecedented rate.
How do we know that?
We have a lot of different ways of measuring it. We have land-based measures. We have ocean measures. We have satellite-based measures. Weather balloons.
Now, I'm sorry. I just want to have kind of a discussion. I'm not really trying to cut you off, but
sure.
I rather just, so I don't mean to be doing that, but I want to go like point by point. If it gets too far down the road, then we kind of lose track. But now, satellite measurement, that has to be relatively recent, doesn't it?
The satellite measurements are the satellites were basically launched around 1979, and they show the same rate of warming as the other indicators, which is about 0.3 to 0.4 degrees Fahrenheit per decade for the past 30 years. Obviously, I'm not
go
back much further than that.
I'm certainly not aware of that. What I've read about satellites is there's showed no change in the last 30 years. Now, the other demand, well, no,
that's just not a true statement.
No, okay. You have look. You have what you say. I have what I say.
No.
Let's go. And thermometers. What are the other devices that have been used for 100 or so years? What are the devices?
I would recommend that people go to a website called skepticalscience.org. They will find all of the data sets. There's really not any argument that the satellite data shows warming.
Okay. That's simply not true, but all right. Now, let's go back. What have been used for over 100 years? They're basically thermometers, aren't they?
Thermometers are one of the ways that we know it's warming. There are, literally dozens and dozens of different ways that we measure warming. We can see, we use the satellites not just to measure temperature, but to measure ice loss in Greenland and Antarctica, which leads to sea level rise. Wait
a second. What ice loss is there in Antarctica?
Antarctica has been losing a tremendous amounts of ice in the last few decades.
Okay.
Been confirmed.
What evidence in temperature trends do you have that shows an increase in average temperature? Wasn't this the coldest winter in Europe in the last 100 years?
No. There certainly were parts of Europe that were cold, but the World Meteorological Organization just said that 2011 was the 11th warmest year on record, and that the last decade was the hottest decade on record. The 2010.
That once again is not true. And if you look at the weather measurements from the United States, if you look at every state's weather measurements, that the warmest temperatures in the United States in almost all the states was before 1950.
That was true until last year.
It's not.
On record, and in fact, Texas and Oklahoma blew out the record.
Not true. The previous record in Oklahoma, it's true that this last summer, June or July, was the warmest in Oklahoma, but the previous one was 57 years ago. If the increase in temperature is according to increase due to carbon dioxide emissions, then one would expect to see a steady increase in temperature, not a 57-year difference between a high now and a high before. But let's just talk about global warming in general. Let's talk about carbon dioxide. Where does most carbon dioxide come from?
If you mean where does most of the net increase in carbon dioxide?
No. Where does most of carbon dioxide come from?
Right now, there's two different things people need to consider when they're concerned about whether we're changing the climate. And I think let's step back from this. I think it's
well, why can't you answer that? I mean, you can discuss the increase.
What the climate scientific community has said. You are certainly entitled to your opinion and to state whatever.
Why don't you just tell me where most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from? I don't think there's debate on that. Where does most of the carbon dioxide?
The majority of the increase in carbon dioxide.
Not the increase.
Responsible for the warming.
Stop. First of all, there's no warming. And where is most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere come from?
Why do you say there's no warming?
There isn't any warming. That's my assertion.
Overwhelming.
There's no evidence whatsoever there's any warming, and you can make up all the data that you want. Why don't you just?
Can I ask you a question?
Why don't you? You can ask me a question. Answer my question first. Where does most of the carbon dioxide? Why won't you answer my question?
Because you're denying a basic fact of science.
There is no basic fact that the Earth is getting warmer due to the man-made emission of carbon dioxide. Where does most of the carbon dioxide?
Sign off.
Whose administration?
190 nations.
What do I care about that? I mean, what difference does that make? The opinions of a bunch of bureaucrats in a bunch of countries. Why won't you answer where most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from? You know what it is.
Why don't you tell the audience, since you seem to know?
It comes from the breakdown of organic substances by bacteria.
Right, but that was when we were in a steady state. Now we are.
It's still the most. It's the
tons of carbon dioxide,
which is peanuts. That is peanuts compared to what is naturally produced. What percentage of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from the combustion of fossil fuel due to man's activities? What percentage?
Essentially all of the carbon dioxide that is responsible for warming comes from human activity.
Why do you keep doing that? Why? First of all, I don't buy that. First of all, there's no warming, and you refuse to answer the question. Okay, 97% of the carbon dioxide in the environment comes from natural processes.
And that's why temperatures
is that true or not?
Only slowly.
Is that true or not?
Century.
No, wait. Is that true or not? Is that true? Well, okay, let me ask you another question. What is the dominant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere? What is the dominant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere on Earth?
I don't think this is a productive discussion. You're basically contradicting basic science that has been established by all of the leading scientists in the world.
That's not true. If you're not going, if that were true,
you can deny what all the world scientists say and what all the world governments say, because
once they all thought the world's government. I mean, why do I care what the world's governments say?
You don't care what the United States and Great Britain and Germany and France.
You think I care what Bill Clinton or George Bush or Barack Obama say about the environment? I couldn't care less.
Well,
do you think I care about what
your region of Texas has been in its driest period for the last 12 months should be of concern to your listeners, because those same people.
What does that got to do with global warming? What does that got to do with global warming? What does that got to do with global warming? You don't. What is the most? What is? Why won't you answer?
Prediction.
You say you're not really a scientist, are you? You're really not. No, you're not.
Are you a scientist?
Yes, I am.
You are. What's your scientific degree?
I have an MD degree.
But you're a medical doctor. You're not a scientist.
Well, I think that if anyone who says that a medical doctor, so you're saying a medical doctor is not a scientist?
Of course not. You're a doctor.
Why? What is the most common? What is the most common? What is the most common? What is the most? What is the predominant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere? What is it? It's water vapor, isn't it?
If there were no greenhouse gases, let's go back to very basic physics. There is no dispute that certain gases trap heat.
What are those gases?
Let me finish. If
You brought it. What are the gases? I'm asking.
Can I finish?
Go ahead.
If there were no greenhouse gases,
yeah,
the planet would be 60 degrees Fahrenheit colder, and it would not support life as we know it.
Okay.
It's beyond dispute.
Right.
It is beyond dispute that gases like water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases.
Nitrous oxide, a few others.
In the atmosphere, the more it warms up the planet. It's just not. It's basic physics.
No, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong about that. It depends on what gases there are, and there's all other kinds of factors involved. But what is the most dominant? What is the most dominant greenhouse gas in the atmosphere?
The one that currently does most of the warming right now is, of course, water vapor, a relatively short-lived greenhouse gas, but it is a molecule in the atmosphere. But most of the warming right now is done by water vapor, and of course, the hotter it gets, because of the other greenhouse gases, the more water vapor there is in the atmosphere. So
doesn't water vapor block the sun's radiation coming to the Earth?
I thought you were a scientist. Water is transparent to light.
Doesn't water vapor absorb radiant energy?
Water vapor is transparent. Is not water transparent?
What happens when radiant energy hits liquid water?
What?
Simple enough question. You understand that?
Because
you don't understand. It doesn't evaporate.
Again.
It doesn't evaporate.
Define what you mean by radiant energy? Radiant energy.
Radiant.
If you mean the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah. Coming from the sun.
Water is obviously transparent to light.
The water molecule doesn't absorb any energy coming from the sun.
Well, obviously water is not fully transparent across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and that's why it is the greenhouse gas. It traps heat. Heat is on the infrared end of the spectrum.
Right. But water vapor does absorb infrared rays.
It's just like carbon dioxide and methane and the human-caused greenhouse gases.
Okay, so water will block some of the rays will prevent the sun's radiation from hitting the surface of the Earth, the water that's in the atmosphere in the form of clouds or water droplets or vapor. You're the one who brought up that more water vapor in the environment occurs because the Earth is getting warmer, and I'm saying the counter to that is that the water vapor will absorb the radiant energy, which is why areas which are humid tend not to get quite as hot as dry regions, even though they're receiving the same amount of radiant energy.
You're just confusing your listeners by using the phrase radiant energy. Let's go back to the basics.
Yeah.
The greenhouse effect, or what's called the greenhouse effect, is that most of the energy from the sun comes in the visible, and the atmosphere, the greenhouse gases, are largely transparent to the greenhouse to visible light. So the visible light goes through the atmosphere. It gets absorbed by the Earth, which is dark colored over large stretches, and it re-radiates. It heats up, and it re-radiates in the infrared.
Yeah.
And that infrared is then blocked by the greenhouse gases, which include water vapor and carbon dioxide and methane. So that's what you're describing. The fact that water vapor traps heat is precisely why the more carbon dioxide that you put in the atmosphere and the more methane you put in the atmosphere, and you trap more heat, the planet warms up, and you evaporate water and you get more water vapor in the atmosphere, and that water vapor traps heat. The water vapor is basically a feedback.
Clouds have color. Why do the clouds have color?
Clouds are separate from water vapor.
Clouds are not water vapor? They're not water droplets?
You're trying to confuse your audience by combining two different things. The water vapor feedback is totally different from clouds. Yes, clouds are made up of water vapor, but the substantial amount of water that is the water vapor feedback is not in the form of clouds. It's just in the form of more moisture in the atmosphere.
Right, which absorbs radiant energy as well, doesn't it?
But it lets the sunlight through. You're right. You're agreeing with me. Water vapor traps heat. It is like a blanket
both ways
over the earth. Unlike a blanket, it is transparent to visible light. And that's why I'm glad we agree that water vapor traps heat, and that the more that's in the atmosphere, the hotter the earth will get. It is a feedback effect. The more you put human emissions in, the more the planet warms up. It definitely, obviously, when oceans and water gets hotter, you evaporate more water, and obviously warmer air can hold more moisture. That is another basic fact of physics.
Yeah.
So yes, you have described a central feedback that is driving the global warming.
There is no global warming, and that is not the central feedback. The fact of the matter is that the water vapor tends to conserve energy in whether it's coming in from the sun or whether it's being re-radiated from the earth, which is why humid regions don't get as hot as desert regions, and why desert regions cool off so much more rapidly than humid regions. But why don't you know there's a higher greenhouse gas concentration on Mars than on Earth, right?
Mars has an incredibly thin atmosphere, so
but it has a greater greenhouse gas concentration.
It doesn't matter. Mars's atmosphere is inconsequential compared to ours. Let's repeat, it is the atmosphere of the Earth, the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that keep the Earth 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it otherwise would.
Right, but there's a greenhouse gas effect on Mars, isn't there?
Mars has an inconsequential atmosphere. If you want to know where there's a souped up, greenhouse effect, let's go to Venus.
I know about Venus. Let's go back to Mars. Let's go back to Mars. In Mars, the concentration because Mars has a greenhouse concentration greater than Earth's. Mars has nearly double the greenhouse gas concentration of molecules in its atmosphere as does Earth. Okay.
But it doesn't have an atmosphere to speak of. That's why
the atmosphere that it does have has more greenhouse gas concentration. In other words, more dense greenhouse gas concentration than Earth does.
I thought you were a scientist. You're talking about something that's irrelevant. Mars has no atmosphere to speak of.
Mars' atmosphere exists. It has a greenhouse gas effect. That is why Mars doesn't get as cold or as hot. Primarily doesn't get as cold as the moon, for example. Well, let's go on to another topic. Now, obviously, we're not going to get any kind of resolution here. But let's go on. Let me make this assertion that the whole greenhouse gas global warming hysteria is a scam by organizations to make money and to increase their power.
Silly.
And let's talk about gasohol. Let's talk about gasohol.
You're basically saying
that you're a fraud.
No, I don't care what you're saying about me. You're saying,
you're a fraud. Let's talk about gasohol. Let's talk about.
You're listening to.
Let's talk about.
I didn't come. I thought when your people when you asked for this interview, I was told that you would be a polite person. You've now called me a fraud. Now, who would ever...
Well, you're the one that said I'm not a scientist because I'm only a doctor.
You've invited me to your house, and now you start calling me names. So I think you've discredited yourself.
Well, I think you've discredited MIT.
Explain to me why anyone would talk to you when you make up stuff that isn't true. You're ignoring
because you're wrong. Because you're wrong, and you won't even answer simple questions. When I ask you what is the most common, what causes most of the CO2 in the environment, you won't even answer my question. Well, when I ask you what is the most, you won't even answer my question. You have your own agenda. You have your own agenda. You're part of the government apparatus.
I know I'm part of a big conspiracy.
You are.
Every scientist in the world.
You're part. Yes, there's not every scientist.
Every journal in the world.
That's not true. That's simply you're the one that's making this up. You have no. You're telling me. I'm telling you facts. You refuse to acknowledge them. I'm telling you that carbon dioxide is more prevalent in the atmosphere of Mars than it is on Earth by a factor of 40.
All right. Well, anyway, you you invite me on your show to call me names. I think we're basically through here. I came for a very simple reason. The people of South Texas need to know that it's going to get hotter and drier in the future, and sea levels are going to rise, and they need to plan for it. Now, you guys have won.
Sea level. Why are sea levels going to rise?
Sea levels have been rising for decades, and they've been rising faster in recent decades.
Where exactly, and where exactly do you know that, and what countries can you give me some numbers? Where exactly?
You love the satellite data. The satellite data shows an acceleration in
Just tell me what coastal areas, what countries have had a significant increase in their water water level in the last 100 years, so we can look it up. Just give me the names of the countries.
Louisiana.
Louisiana was underwater when they for how long? Louisiana's been below sea level forever, hasn't it?
Well, sea levels are rising and the land is sinking, so Louisiana has the worst of both possible worlds.
Well, Louisiana's living so just somewhere else, okay? Give me somewhere else.
Bay, there was just a report
Where?
from the Galveston Bay annual report. Sea levels are rising. It's not in dispute.
And there aren't areas where water levels are going down?
Where water levels are going down, or land is rising. There's no fundamentally. There's no question, because of the way that the great oceans are set up, that the overwhelming majority of places can see sea level rise, but some places can see a flat seas and or slight declines. But it's just it's
all right. So we see variations in that. Don't we also see variations in temperature, where some areas are experiencing unusual cold weather? I mean, wasn't the New York? Didn't they have an unusually cold winter this last winter?
No, New York has had one of the warmest winters on record. The entire United States has had. I mean, maybe you have missed it, but we've just been through the strongest heat wave in the history of the United States. Blowout.
Well, Eastern Europe had the coldest winter in 100 years, and Australia is experiencing unusual cold. And in fact, the United States has been warmer than it is today. Some areas are higher, but Chicago is going back down to 50 degrees on Monday. On Monday, it's going back to 50 degrees. And, you're saying the assertion of increased temperature is 1 to 2 degrees in 100 years, going up 7 or 8 degrees from one previous height to the next has got to be something other than global warming, because global warming, even by the biggest hysterics, is not more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years.
Well, I think I don't think this interview is terribly productive. Like I said, I think
it has been. I think that we see the closed-mindedness of the elitists coming out of the government and out of the East Coast. So I think it's been very enlightening. Your refusal to answer any of the questions, your dogmatic approach, not calling the doctors scientists, I think says a lot. You're just an elitist. You're just arrogant. And thank you for calling whatever. 710 KRV Talkback with Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Well, that's the government for you. That's the kind of people that we have in our system of education. All right, so wouldn't answer any questions, and why he didn't say anything about what, because only 3% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is from the combustion of fossil fuels, and water vapor is 25 times more prevalent than carbon dioxide, and water vapor is a much more effective greenhouse gas molecule. He wouldn't answer those questions because he has an agenda, and that agenda is based on energy and money. More after this break. We're back in our self-contained bulletproof room. I mean, this is what we have to deal with. These are the ignoramuses that we have to deal with in our society. He refused to answer any of the questions, and you know why? Because he knew he was on the wrong side of the issue. Clearly, water absorbs radiant energy from the sun. Mars, even though its atmosphere is 1/60th of Earth's, has a greenhouse gas concentration 1.7 times greater than Earth's and a carbon dioxide concentration 40 times greater. Mars does have a greenhouse gas effect. That's why it has a temperature range of 100 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas the moon, which is closer to the sun than Mars, has a 500 degrees variance because it has no atmosphere at all. If the warming of the Earth, as was admitted by Mr. Rome, Dr. Rome, is due to the greenhouse gas concentration, then clearly, if oxygen and nitrogen are transparent to that effect, and it's only the greenhouse gases, water vapor, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, methane, and a few others, then clearly, if Mars has a greater concentration of exactly those molecules which cause the greenhouse effect, then clearly if you have 1.7 times or nearly double the amount of molecules as in the atmosphere, greenhouse gas molecules, then certainly you would expect a greater greenhouse gas effect if it is those molecules that cause the greenhouse gas effect. He never would answer the questions. He refused to acknowledge. I know very well that Venus has an atmosphere 90 times more dense than Earth and has 9,000 times more concentration of greenhouse gas effect. It's a different story. I understand all of that. I mean, you know, maybe I'm sorry. Maybe I shouldn't have called him a fraud, but he is, or he's ignorant, or one or the other. But the fact of the matter is, this is the kind of closed-minded thinking. This is the kind of fascism that we have to put up with. There's no evidence on satellite evidence whatsoever. There's been an increase in temperatures and in melting of the ice. And the other thing is that even if this is the hottest summer in Texas, let's say, or last year was, even if it is, the previous hottest summer was in 1957. It was 1954. If the greenhouse gas effect and global warming is a consequence of industrialization and combustion of fossil fuels, since industrialization has gone up every single year, there should have been a steady increase in summer temperatures, not this up and down. You would have expected the previous hottest summer in Texas to have been 2009, 2008, 2000, but not 1950, not 1954. That makes no sense. Wow. Okay, we'll go in order here. I guess I ought to have Dr. Rome on this program all the time. He seems to have stirred up some interest. We'll go first to Elio in McAllen, 7 KRV. Thanks for calling. What's your comment, please?
Doctor, you and me, we're in danger of being burned at the stake as heretics. I mean, you questioned a scientist. That's like questioning a journalist. They're the high priests of our modern society. Don't you know that?
Well, no, you're exactly right. He refused to answer basic questions because he knew I was leading him into the truth, and he does not want to go there. But my gosh, I'm just a doctor. I'm not a scientist. Look, he's a physicist. I've had a lot more training in my field, which I don't think anyone says that, medicine is a science. Whoever says it's not has got a problem. But the arrogance of this individual and the refusal, and he was the one that was condescending. I ended up finally calling him a fraud because I couldn't take it anymore. After all, I'm just human. But my gosh, he would never answer my questions.
You had amazing self-restraint. If he came to my house and acted like that, he'd be on the curb nursing some wounds, not worrying about what I called him.
Right.
I mean, listen, I have a Master of Science degree, and like you, probably took courses in research design and statistics. And the first week in class, we were handed a study and seemed perfectly reasonable, but the instructor took it apart piece by piece and showed how flawed it was. So all the studies in the world are meaningless if you want the outcome to indicate what you wish it to indicate.
Sure. Okay. All right. Thanks. Bunch of more calls here for some reason. So thanks for calling. I appreciate it. I know you call from time to time, and I'm glad that you do. Thank you. The same kind of attitude we see with everything the government does. If the hysteria and the lack of restraint and the lack of insight by Dr. Rome in his field is exactly translated into the pro-choice movement. If you talk with someone in pro-choice, they have the exact same hysteria based upon the same indoctrination techniques, which are completely false. And you see that in no matter what we do across the board in these so-called academicians who are really not academicians at all. He refused to answer even the basic questions because he knew where it was taking him, and he was taking him to the truth. He never got into the entire deal about gasohol, which is a whole nother gigantic multi-billion-dollar scam by the government based upon these energy concerns and global warming. The whole deal with solar energy and Solyndra. You can't get $600 million in a loan from the government and then go, unless you're a fraud these days. And they went bankrupt. That's our money. Here we go. We have David in McAllen, 7 at KRV. Thanks for calling. What's your comment, please?
Sure, thank you for taking my call. I wanted to make a comment and an observation, and then I'll hang up and let you talk. What I heard with the speaker previous to the one you just took was an invitation to your radio show, and he was trying, in my opinion, to answer questions and add. I don't care if the guy's from the public sector or the private sector, but when you got into the heated debate, you would ask a question and not give him time to think and respond. You would then just overspeak and not give him a chance to answer your questions. What I have observed in the past, not just today, is that you seem to be of the opinion that you're an expert in every field and every walk of life, and that kind of bothers me. And I think it's your ego and feeling that you have to prove that you're right no matter what and come up with all of these ideas to prove your point to the basic issue.
Okay, was that it? All right, thanks for your call. Well, I only talk about things that I have researched and studied. It's not off the top of my head. When I asked the question, what is the most common cause of CO2 in the environment, and then he refuses to answer, and then I ask it again and he refuses to answer, then what am I supposed to do? And then if you remember, if you were listening, he then asked me to tell him what the answer was, and I did, and of course I was correct. I guess he was hoping I was going to make a mistake, but I fooled him. When I ask a question of someone, then I expect them to answer. Now, he's the one that insulted me first. He's the one that said, I'm just a doctor, I'm a nothing, I'm a nobody, what do I know about the scientific method? But the scientific method is something that is used by physicians with every patient and every day. Okay? So, David, if you don't care for that, if you call me and you tell me that I'm self-centered and egotistic and arrogant, that's your opinion. But if I said something that you think is false, then you tell me what that is. And if you're right, then okay. But don't be calling me and saying that because you don't like my personality, that what I'm saying is wrong. You may not like my personality, but if you have an issue with what I'm saying, if you have an issue with any information that I'm giving, then I want to hear it, and I'd be happy to have a discussion about that. But don't be saying something that you think I'm whatever because of my personality. I'm fighting a war here, and we're outnumbered vastly. And if you don't understand that, just look at the TV and listen to the radio and watch the women marching down the street saying that they have the right to kill their undelivered children because it's part of their body, and I have to live in an environment of flat worlders. You got something to say about me, about what I've said, then you say it, and don't be attacking my personality, okay? If you want to go, get your own program. So now we have Dr. Dorothy Adams, 7th and KORV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Thanks for calling. What's your comment?
Dr. Gelman, you were absolutely right in your facts, and he was absolutely wrong in his. And if I were going to assess that someone was rude and arrogant, it would have been that visitor that you just had. I was absolutely angered. I have an MD, a PhD, and 5 master's degrees. And let's see, I believe I might know a little bit about science. I am a scientist, and I do not agree that we are undergoing global warming. Another thing, he said that Antarctica is losing mass. It is not. Actually, Antarctica has not lost mass, and it's actually, some studies show that it has gained mass.
That's true. That's true. It has. There's no evidence whatsoever that the Antarctic is losing mass, on ice mass. Another thing, we have the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes in up around the Chicago region. The Great Lakes were created by retreating glaciers at the end of the last ice age, which was over 10,000 years ago. If Dr. Rome, if that was happening today, would be blaming that on man-made global warming. But obviously it's not true. The entire northern hemisphere was covered by ice 10,000 years ago. And so, and all that ice disappeared, obviously could not have had anything to do with anything man was doing. But,
no, absolutely, you are right. Furthermore, your comments, his comments on whether there would be more or less water in the atmosphere was absolutely ridiculous. And by the way, water, as you know, water has the highest heat capacity of any naturally occurring
exactly
substance.
I never got to that point because he never let me move on from the basic questions, but because he was so arrogant and condescending. But you're exactly right. Water's capacity for absorbing of energy is 540 times greater than carbon dioxide.
Absolutely.
And so that water is 10 times more prevalent in the mass of water in the atmosphere is 10 times greater than carbon dioxide, and it has a 540 times capacity for absorbing energy. Carbon dioxide in the environment is insignificant as far as the greenhouse gas effect in our environment.
Absolutely. Plus, the changes in heat on this planet, you know, the ice age and then the warming and the ice age and the warming. And do you remember back in? You were probably very young back then.
During the ice age, yeah.
Yeah, we were going to have an ice age in the 70s.
I remember that, and there was a Time magazine cover, which I have on my DVD, which shows that what they were, and I remember that what they were anticipating was a new ice age in 1970s. And John Hansen was the one who created those programs, the same guy who's now saying that global warming is inevitable. The same guy.
But you, knowing many scientists as you do, you know very well what put me off when they first started all of this scam was that they said, and all scientists agree. Well, I got to tell you, put two of us in a room together, and we're not going to agree. It's an argument.
No, you're exactly right. How many universally held beliefs by the majority of scientists turned out not to be true? Albert Einstein. You know, Albert Einstein, he never even went to college, did he? Maybe that's why he was so smart. But the fact of the matter is what Albert Einstein said refuted what most of the scientists in the world thought at that time. Scientists are always into inquiry. And you're exactly right. You get 2 or 3 scientists in a room, and they're going to be disagreeing about everything. When you hear somebody says everybody agrees to something, you can bet your life that that guy doesn't know what he's talking about.
Absolutely. And in some of the research that gets funded, because there's a great deal of politics in science these days, not that it hadn't always been. But in any case, one of my professors a long time ago said, you know, if you write the grant, tell me what you're looking for, and I'll tell you what you'll find.
There's all kinds of evidence that prove your point exactly. Once you deviate from the clerical class and viewpoint, you lose your funding. How do you guarantee funding? Well, like Solyndra, you guarantee funding by giving to them what they want, even though you know it's not going to work, but you walk off with $570 million. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, thanks for calling. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Now we have Jack 7 in KRV. Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. I guess I'm never going to get to the Constitution now. All right, go on. What do you have to say, Jack?
The caller who called just before Doc Adams was using what is called an ad hominem argument. He was simply attacking you rather than attacking your argument, and that's so fallacious. It's insane.
But that's what they do. You're exactly right. I mean, that's what politics is. If you have something to say if you tell me that when I say the baby's not part of the mother and I'm wrong, if you tell me that carbon dioxide produced by man is the reason there's global warming, then you're right and I'm wrong. Okay, but prove it. Don't start saying my arguments are no good because I'm arrogant and I have a big ego. I'm here fighting a war, fighting a battle. I'm outnumbered, okay?
You're not,
1,000,000 to 1.
You're not arrogant. You don't have a big ego. You wouldn't last 5 minutes on these radio stations if you did. That was just a personal attack on you rather than attacking your arguments. Now, as far as this so-called scientist from MIT, he was involved in something called, in terms of logical fallacies, petitio principii, assuming the premise. It's also called cogito ergo sum. I think this to be so, therefore it is so. That's why he wouldn't answer your questions. He says, "Well, it's true." He wanted you to accept his premise that we were in global warming and then argue from there. That is totally faulty logic, utterly faulty. And it was his attitude of arrogance. You're obviously not a scientist. You know, anyone.
Right. If I don't agree with him, it's not that there's something wrong with my argument. Is that I don't have the degree, and he's a physicist. Though what makes a physicist a particular expert in climatology, I don't know. But I guess when you're coming from MIT or one of those other phony baloney Eastern elitist establishments. But it's true. They make you believe in those schools, because I have attended like graduations over there at Harvard and things like that, and they make no doubt about it that they consider themselves the elite of the United States. And they don't, when we say something here in the hinterlands like Texas, when we say something, well, it doesn't matter what we say, we're not the exalted. We don't have the divine right that they have. And I mean, that was not a scientist speaking. No scientist that I know, even when they disagree with me, talks like that. It's a conversation of ideas, and you listen to the ideas, and you answer the questions, and you refute what you don't agree with, but you don't denigrate the other person. I called him a fraud after 25 minutes on the air because it was pretty well obvious at that time that he is a fraud. But it's exactly the kind of fraud that the government promotes.
Ben, he's in effect, whether he is overtly or whether he is consciously, he is a government agent. I have a nephew who works on the space program at MIT. He doesn't have that kind of personality.
No, real scientists do not behave like that. Thanks a lot. Getting to the end here, so thanks for calling. I appreciate it. Now we have Will calling from the mobile 79 KRV. Thanks for calling. What's your comment, please?
Hey, well, even though I'm not in the field anymore, I got my first degree in geology, and you know, in simple terms, I mean, the world has warmed and cooled and warmed and cooled and warmed and cooled for millions of years. So you know, you can't. It's ridiculous to try to be able to trace that to man-made global warming. Secondly, the reason why you don't usually have a lot of callers, Dr. Gelman, is because you're like the professor, and we're just taking in all this information that you put out there, and to increase our knowledge. And thirdly, I believe it was Abraham Lincoln that said that those who can do and those who can't teach, and that's exactly the way it is in the universities these days. You know, if they can't cut it, then they just spew their views based on how much money they can get.
Okay. Thanks. I appreciate that. We're coming to the end of the program. Thanks for calling, Will. Anytime. And I appreciate the kind words. I often wonder about that. I don't come onto this program and talk off the top of my head. I have no agenda other than to try to inform individuals in things that I don't see anywhere else. If there were other programs, I don't want to repeat. That's one of the reasons I get into discussions with some of these marketing people and all that. They say, oh, the hot thing is Lady Gaga today or whatever. I don't care about Lady Gaga. She's here today, gone tomorrow. She was unheard of 10 years ago. I'm looking for long-term, universal truths. I research everything that I do, and I re-research. I never let anything lie fallow. I was going to, but I ran out of time. I've run out of time. I was going to talk about the Constitution, some new things about old topics, the Commerce Clause and the income tax, which I thought I had researched to death. But the mind is an interesting thing, that it looks at something, it evolves. There's there's a maturation of thought. And the more you look at something, the more you study something. I guess it's maybe like a musician. A musician can play a piece 100 or 1,000 times and then find things on the 1,001st time that he hadn't noticed the previous 1,000 times. And that is because you have to, in order to understand something at a certain level, you have to understand first the basic level. And so as I'm learning the basic levels, I understand things which were not, even though I'm reading it and looking at it, I really don't understand all the nuances associated with it. And so I have to reach a certain level of understanding in order to be able to recognize what the researcher has put in there, but I didn't have the basics to be able to recognize it. And so there are things which I have seen in the Constitution, for example, or in global warming. In global warming, even though I had actually made a DVD on the global warming hoax and thought I understood it in all of it entirely, I run across, as Dr. Adams was mentioning, about the heat absorptive capacity of water vapor. And I was looking at, and I hadn't even recognized that, and therefore I'm adding a supplement to my global warming discussion, because as it turns out, probably the most single important component about the greenhouse gas effect is an effect that only water vapor has, which is the latent heat of vaporization and of fusion. And that is something that I really hadn't been completely cognizant of, even though I'm looking at these things all the time. And so now it turns out that there's a whole nother vista. It's an exploration. These topics tend to be the same, I understand, but there's always more insight, there's always more to it. And so that I don't ever come on this program without researching what I say, and I'm always trying to learn. And by being on this program, it helps me, it gives me the incentive and discipline to learn. 710 KRV, be back next week. Thanks for calling. Be back next week, KURV.